webinar. Today we're going to cover surrogacy for gay dads and the tough questions they may face during their journey to parenthood. And I'm really thrilled to introduce two amazing people from our surrogacy community. Joey Guzman-Kuffel is a Southern California native and who was born and raised in Los Angeles. Joey has a master's degree in counseling psychology from Argosy University in San Diego with an emphasis on marriage and family therapy. Having been an intended parent and having a daughter through surrogacy, Joey came to realize the important role that mental health professionals play in the IVF and surrogacy process. He sees patients from his offices at his private practice, counseling with Joey in San Diego, California. So welcome, Joey.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We also have Jeanette Passwaters, who is a licensed practical nurse and our senior case manager and surrogacy specialist here at Donor Concierge. Along with founding her own boutique surrogacy agency, Jeanette served as a gestational carrier for 3 lovely couples that she remains connected with. Helping to create families is her true passion. She's married with 3 children and is the loving grandmother of 3. And I just want to say to everybody, if you have questions, we're going to talk a little bit, but if there are questions, feel free to write them in the chat box, send us I think you can do a direct message and we can answer them as we go along. So first, I just wanted to ask Joey, just tell us a little bit about your practice. What types of clients do you see and at what stage of their fertility journey?
Sure. So in my practice, I've been seeing clients for third-party reproduction for about 2 years now. And the type of clients that I see are intended parents, donors, and gestational carriers who are interested in participating in third-party reproduction. I provide consultations and evaluations to assess the readiness to participate, in third-party reproduction, and also counseling. So there are times where I'm able to provide counseling services for them so that they can process what they're experiencing during this, surrogacy process. And I see them at different stages, really. I could see them at the initial onset of, just the evaluation in itself, again, assessing to see what, their readiness to participate in this process. And along the way, if they need support, and then also depending on where the intended parents or the surrogates are residing, that also, depends whether if I'm able to provide counseling services or not. But I see them at different stages throughout this whole family building journey. And I'm very excited to continue to assist in these evaluations and counseling services. I am also continuing to grow my private practice and reach out to different, fertility clinics and surrogacy agencies. I'm very passionate about this. As you mentioned, I'm someone who has built his own family through third-party reproduction, and I think that there's a lot to continue to learn about in this field and continue to educate the people that we are assisting throughout this process.
So we're talking about surrogacy for gay dads today, so a 2-dad couple. What are some of the issues that you raise with them when they're considering a surrogacy journey? So if they come to you at the beginning of their journey?
Yeah, well, some of the things that we definitely cover, and I think it's important when you have 2 gay dads wanting to build a family, is deciding on or just exploring, the idea of are both dads going to be providing sperm samples for the creation of the embryos. I think that it's important to explore that and to, think about whether if only one person is going to be providing, the sperm sample to create embryos, will the other partner be okay not being the genetic parent? I've had cases where, when I first assess them, they both feel comfortable with the decision that only one parent is going to be the genetic parent. And after they've completed their process, the other partner then starts to experience some feelings of resentment, or they don't know how to process not being the genetic parent. And so I think that, having experienced that with a couple intended parents, I feel that it's important to explore those pieces about, if only one parent is going to be the genetic father, is the other person going to be okay? And again, just having time to explore that with them. So those are one of the things that I raise in our interviews. And also too, depending on the type of embryo transfer that they're going to be doing. Sometimes they want to do a single embryo transfer, and then they explore the idea of doing a sibling journey, and at that point then maybe the other partner will then be the genetic father at that point. So a lot of these questions we explore, and we're making sure that you understand, or that they understand, what does this mean for them individually and for them as a couple.
So that kind of brings me to the matching process. What are some of the misconceptions that dads might have about the surrogate's role? And one of the things that I'm sure Jeanette will agree with me is it's so helpful for people to have mental health support before they even start the journey and start doing the surrogacy journey. But what are some of the things you hear from dads about what this all means, what the surrogate's role herself?
I think that some of the misconceptions that I've come across in the interviews that I've had with intended parents is, the idea of not wanting to have a relationship with the surrogate, or being very much involved because they don't want the surrogate to act as a parent. Sometimes it's that, oh, well, we don't know if we want to keep in contact with her because we don't want her to, be involved with the parenting. And so it's educating about, that this isn't the role that they're trying to take. And that, so again, exploring that, like what does it mean to them, keeping a relationship with them throughout the process and after the process. And then again, just making them aware that the surrogate isn't trying to be, the intended child's, mother. The surrogate, has her own family, and I believe that they definitely understand what their role is. And so again, just kind of clarifying a lot of these misconceptions, but that's one of the ones that I have come across frequently, is fear of developing a relationship with the gestational carrier because they don't want the gestational carrier to become that mother figure for their child.
Jeanette, can you understand that? Have you had experience with people feeling like that? And as a surrogate, how did you feel?
For me, one of the things that I've experienced in both having, my own journey and knowing and having my own agency, and talking with other surrogates, I think one of the biggest struggles that we see is coming from, I think, intended mothers. And so this is a little bit off topic from gay dads, but I think coming from intended mothers, I think that lack of control, and that may be very real too for, I think, dads, because in surrogacy there really is a lack of control for a lot of things over the pregnancy. And I think sometimes letting go, or coming to terms with not having a lot of control over things. I think that's been one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in all my years of surrogacy. So,
what do you feel, Joey, are the biggest issues that can be challenging when dealing with a relationship between the intended parent and surrogate? So as they're kind of getting it used to the idea, or maybe they've had a meeting, what are the things that you advise people to do in terms of establishing a good relationship?
I think we start off by exploring like their comfort level in terms of, the type of relationship they would like to carry on with the gestational carrier. I think that it's important for intended parents to, again, takes time to explore, like, okay, how do I feel about, having a relationship with this individual? And then also as a couple too. And I suggest that, that they be transparent, about how they feel about the relationship or the type of relationship that they would like to have with the gestational carrier during that match meeting, if possible. I know that there's a lot of things that, are discussed during that initial match meeting. And only so many things can be covered in that one match meeting. But I think that I think it's important to be transparent about how you feel about this and giving your point of view to the gestational carrier so that she can also understand like where you stand. And then, I also recommend that gestational carriers be transparent with intended parents about their expectation about the relationship so that the intended parents can also have an idea of, okay, where she stands on the relationship. And then of course, as you enter into this third party, relationship, the relationship will evolve throughout the process. And but I think it's important to start off with that transparency piece.
I totally agree with Joey. I think that it's incredibly important to talk about it. I think it should be indicated when they're filling out an intended parent profile. The same goes for the surrogate when they're filling out their surrogate profiles for intended parents to look at, because that's such an important piece of the matchmaking process. Obviously, we're respectful of what people wish and what their expectations are. So I think it's such an important factor for surrogacy agencies to know what that looks like from both parties, and it to be indicated prior to a match, and then certainly during the match call is very important. But Michelle, to go back, I'm sorry, I might have jumped ahead a little bit, but just to go back from just from my experience, it's a very real feeling for intended parents, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, we hear a lot of scary stories. We hear all the bad stories about surrogacy sometimes, that get sensationalized, where there's so many wonderful, amazing stories that happen every day in surrogacy. And so a lot of intended parents have a real fear. What if the surrogate wants to keep this baby? Is a very real fear. Coming from surrogates, quite honestly, if we wanted to have a baby, we would, right? Because we're good at that. we're good at having babies. And so I think kind of diminishing that misconception. And I know from my perspective with my relationships that I have with my intended parents, it's not as a motherly figure. I think of my surrogate babies more as my nieces. My nieces, really, they were all girls. So that's how I think of them in terms of my relationship with them.
Do you get into the nitty gritty of like, or do you recommend that people get into the nitty gritty of like what the birth plan, what's going to happen at the birth, and how many times do you go to the appointments with the surrogate? How do you, Joey, do you talk with people about things like that before they even get pregnant?
I do, because I've been an intended parent before, and I knew, for example, for me, it was very important to establish all of these things with our gestational care beforehand, which goes along with the transparency in terms of what I wanted in our relationship. And that allowed for us to explore different things about the whole experience, the birthing process. And I do think it's important to have this discussion with your gestational carrier about what that birth plan may look like, because what I have found is that when there isn't that type of communication throughout that process, there's a lot of feelings of awkwardness or disappointment, or just feeling dissatisfied about the experience because they didn't know how to react or how to respond to one another after, let's say, that the baby was born. So usually, when I do interview intended parents who come back for a sibling journey or a gestational carrier who's doing a second or third journey, and I hear of their experiences where they felt like they didn't have a good experience because once the baby was born, it was like they couldn't connect with the intended parents or vice versa. And there was like these voids that they were experiencing that left them feeling uncomfortable. That's why I, again, say it's important for you guys to talk about these things, and it's okay to talk about these things. So then that way, there isn't any awkwardness. And the more you talk, I believe the more you can learn about one another and connect. So this is a third-party relationship, right? It's like you're getting involved into this intimate relationship with somebody else who's helping you carry your child. And so I think that, like in any relationship, communication is important. So I highly, stress that communication is important and transparency is important so that we can avoid, any of these either ruptured relationships or disappointments. I think that communicating can allow for an intended parent and a gestational carrier to have a smooth and healthy experience.
Jeanette's nodding because I know we've talked about this, about you mentioned before, setting up the expectations even before there's a match meeting, because if you're not all on the same page, and that's what we do a lot at Donor Concierge, making sure everybody's on the same page of how they want it to go. Do they want contact? I know you and I have talked again, Jeanette, about the experience of a surrogate who doesn't have that relationship afterwards, and she really wanted that.
Right. Yeah, and I think that it's okay how they come into this, and both intended parents and gestational carriers alike. It's okay that they maybe want a relationship after the pregnancy, or they don't want a relationship after the pregnancy. It's understanding that those are okay. Those are okay feelings, and it's okay to have those wishes and those desires. It's just important that everybody's on the same page going into it.
Absolutely.
That was one of my questions, actually, about how to talk to, what happens after the birth, what happens at the birth, then what? Like, how do you talk with intended parents about what they want afterwards? Joey?
Do you mean in terms of like the relationship with the gestational carrier?
There's that, but also just like what happened, how do you prepare them for the actual birth?
I see. Well, again, it's just exploring what their idea of that is, and then bringing up different scenarios based on what they're sharing, so that they can explore all the different possibilities that can happen, with the birth process or after the birth. But specifically after the birth, one of the things that I always bring up is, what happens, to the dynamic of the duo or of the couple, because one thing that I find is that as intended parents, gay intended parents, we're so consumed with, wanting to build our family and everything that goes into the process of creating life through this third party reproductive process, that we sometimes don't have enough time to think about like what's going to happen to the relationship after a baby is born. So a lot of us, have been together for many years, and it's just been two people for a long time. But then when you introduce a new human into the dynamic, it can really shift the relationship dynamic. And then also just being aware of what sleep deprivation can do to our mental health when we have a baby who is not, sleeping, and how that impacts us, and how we can easily be triggered and aggravated by not having appropriate sleep, and negotiations about between the relationship about who does what and when, and how you can cope while you're going through these growing pains as you're easing into this new role as a parent. So all of these things are things that we explore in these sessions that I have with intended parents, to kind of get them to see like what happens afterwards. I find it important myself, because I do see intended parents come back to me who are struggling after a baby is born and they don't know what to do. And it's also because not many people are talking about it. It's almost like, oh my gosh, is this not like normal? And I think that it's very typical to experience this. We just don't hear about it enough.
We have a question from somebody who says, my husband has concerns about not loving the baby if he's not the biological father. Do you have any ideas about how I can allay his fears?
Yeah. So the fear about not loving a child if they're not biologically connected to them. I think that, definitely that ties back into some of the things that we were talking earlier about who the genetic parent will be. And those are the things that I bring up to explore with them. I think that, as gay men, I think that regardless of there's genetics, there'll still be your child. I think that you can definitely build a great bond with your child, even if you're not the biological father, and you can love a child even if you're not the biological father. I think that, there are some just, like your parental instinct will just kick in and you will just love your child. And my recommendation on that is, just reassuring, the other party that, that the child is much theirs as they are as to the genetic partner. And having more conversations about it, about how are you feeling about that? Or, do you have any questions about that? And just, again, allowing space to talk and explore these situations.
Is that a common fear? Because I hear that from women who are using egg donors.
Yes. So I think that it is a common fear that there might be a disconnect between the child and the person who is not genetically related to them. And again, this is why it's important to have these conversations ahead of time and to explore what it might be like for you and how can you cope with this. And I really, really highlight those things in my interviews to really just kind of assess to see where they're at. And I also, continue to provide resources to the intended parents or donors, or so that they can continue to receive support throughout the process. Because I don't think it's something that that we can resolve in one session. I think that this is an ongoing process.
And that kind of leads into the conversations you might have with your children too, about where they came from. And how do you suggest people talk with their children about their creation story? And when do they introduce that idea? I mean, they're going to have two dads, so they're going to know that there's something, that there was a donor involved. So.
As someone who is going through that process right now with my own daughter, what I recommend is starting the disclosure process and sharing your children's story with them as early as day one. I say, there's a growing library of surrogacy books for children, and I recommend starting to read these books to your children in infancy to give you that practice, in sharing this information with them. And as they, continue to grow and evolve, you continue to read these books, but maybe you start pointing out, like, depending on the figures, like, oh, this is Papa, or this is Daddy, and this is you, and this is what we did, and just kind of using those types of descriptions to kind of help, again, share this information to your child. Again, it gives you practice on being able to disclose this information while you're disclosing it. But I think that if the earlier we start in sharing this information with our kids, I think it becomes easier for the child to, or just for their story to be normalized. And so I think the sooner we normalize what, surrogacy is, how they came to be, is going to allow for them to develop a healthier sense of self, self-confidence. So I say start as early as you can. What I find is that when we start, disclosing this information at a later point in life, that's when, children, even though later in life, maybe they can process the information a little bit more than they could when they were younger, it's still like a big ball of information for them to hold and to process, that sometimes it's so overwhelmingly that they don't know how to express themselves. And we see, behaviors like isolation or rebellious behavior, tantrums, depending on the age, and so I think that the sooner that we're able to normalize their life story, the healthier it would be for the child and just for the family system in itself.
And of course, to them, they're normal, but what about outside, society? I mean, luckily things are changing. How do you equip them with the tools to deal with questions like, where's your mom? Where's the, I'm assuming that they'll get those questions. Maybe they won't, hopefully, fingers crossed, but how do you think you're going to approach that with your daughter?
Well, I believe, again, transparency is important. I think that when there isn't transparency in a family system, that opens up the door for chaos, and chaos can be, so many different things, and so what we want to do is we want to minimize that or reduce that. And so the way how I'm going about it with my daughter, and in my situation, it's a little bit different because the donor is a known donor. The donor is my sister, and it's my husband's, gametes that we used for this process. And so for her, she's learning that, the donor is her aunt. And so we've already established that this is the role that she is going to have, in our child's life. And and we're sharing with her that, her special aunt was able to donate her the magical eggs, so that we are able to have her, because we really wanted a child and we loved her so much that this is what we needed to do. So I think also just being able to having an idea of how you want to describe the donor and the gestational carrier to your child is also going to be important. And so for us, our gestational carrier is also going to be her auntie, and that's how she knows her by. And I think giving her these informations and letting them know who these people are and what they did is also going to be important for them to also have a healthy sense of self, because it's a part of their identity.
So, Jeanette, are you in contact with some of the families that you carried for?
Yes. Yes. So and Michelle, I know you probably know this already. My oldest surrogate is actually 19. And so she's now an adult, full-fledged adult. My youngest two surrogates are 7 and 5 now, and they're international, both of them. And I've actually visited one of them in London a couple years ago. So yes, I'm very, very much in contact, and very, very happy. Talk to them very frequently, probably on a weekly basis, if not a little more frequently, but very, very close to them. And I certainly understand that I may not have the most typical relationship that intended parents have with their carriers. I can only hope that everybody can have that. I mean, I think certainly, surrogates go into this not with the expectation of having this kind of relationship, but they understand that intended parents, their lives are drastically going to change when these babies come into their life. And so I think typically we go into this with just the expectation of, hey, I'd be happy with just simply occasional updates. That'd be great. So what I tell a lot of people is anything greater than that is just icing on the cake for everyone.
Yeah, Joey, that's a really lovely story that your sister donated the eggs. I mean, I'm pretty sure you probably had mental health therapy for everybody to go through that.
Yes, that's true.
And how does that? I mean, I don't even know where to start with the questions. I think it's really lovely because then you do have that genetic connection. But when somebody's using a donor that, say, maybe through an agency, what do they tell their children? Like, what do you recommend they start with their children?
Again, I believe that it's important as an individual to just explore, like, what are you comfortable with? Like, what do you feel comfortable with in terms of how you see this person, the donor or the gestational carrier, and how do you feel comfortable in terms of, like, how are you going to describe this person to your child, and also just like defining like what the language is. So I know that some intended parents refer to the donor as, like, the donor mother or the surrogate mother, or they just call them mothers, or other people call them different things. So I think understanding like what you want to identify these people are is going to be important, so that when you're sharing this information to your child, your child has, a good understanding of what these things mean, so that they, again, just have more of a clarity as to who these people are and what their roles were. I think it's also important to look at, like, what does it mean to be a mother versus just a donor? Because when you use language as, mother to a child, a mother, that means that the child can, create a narrative that may not be accurate to what the parents are portraying. And so when you use language like mother instead of maybe donor or something like that, I think that a child may perceive, or that maybe that, that a mother didn't want to be a part of their life or something. So we explore all these different things. So I think identifying what the language that we're going to be using and why we're using it and how we're going to share that with the child is all very important.
Do you talk through issues around choosing a donor as well, and the relationship that they may or may not have with a donor? Again, mostly the relationships, there is no relationship with a donor, an egg donor. Sometimes our clients do meet them. Sometimes they request a video, but they don't generally have a relationship with the donor. So how do you navigate that when you're talking with intended parents as they're thinking about all these issues?
Well, I start off by asking, like, the importance of, anonymous versus semi-open, and we kind of explore all those things. And once they share that information with them, I always let them know that, especially nowadays, like it's difficult to, I would say, really just keep things anonymous with like, 23andMe and all these things. And again, exploring like, what is it going to be like for them if their child does have a curiosity for who this person is, and it's maybe, and it's an anonymous, donor. And, what if they found the donor through all these different, genetic, platforms or avenues like 23andMe and stuff like that. And what would it feel like for them to know that they are really curious about that? I also, remind them again the importance of transparency and how that's going to impact their child. Again, the donor, even though there might not be a relationship there, it's an important piece of their identity. And I think that, giving your child the right to this information is important, because again, it just really allows for them to develop much more of a healthier sense of self. Like I said before, I think transparency is important in this process in so many different like avenues or aspects, so I recommend, transparency, and and emphasize the importance in the child having the right to learn who these people are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one of the things that we often will say to our clients is when they're struggling over how to choose a donor, I always say, well, when your child asks you, why did you choose her? What will you say? I liked her hair. I liked that she came from the same heritage as us. I like that she likes mountain biking, and we're not therapists, but we really want people to explore these, as you say, ideas of transparency, because there is no such thing as anonymous egg donation anymore. And it's our job in this field, I think, to educate people that these children do want to know about where they came from.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm glad that you pointed out that, the part of like, about the physical attributes or what they liked about this donor, because we do talk about that, especially also too when maybe it's like a interracial couple, and sometimes, when the genetic, when the father who's not the genetic father, they may be looking at someone who resembles them in their heritage and their culture so that they can get an even mix. And so we explore all of those things and why that's important to them. And then these are things that they can continue to share with their children as well.
So give me some reasons why. I know we've talked a lot, and we know why you should see a therapist. And it's a requirement by ASRM for a surrogacy journey. But why is mental health therapy so important during this process?
Well, I believe it's important because there's an educational component to this. And I think the more information that you have, the better informed decisions you can make throughout this process. It's important to clarify misconceptions about what this process is. It's important to clarify misconceptions about, what the role of the surrogate is, because intended parents, I think we also need to understand that it's not just about us, like just having this baby, like we're entering into a relationship with somebody else, and our behavior and our thoughts, the way how we respond to things will impact the other party, which is the gestational carrier. So it's not just about us, it's about somebody else. So it's important to learn all of these different things so that we can go into this process, having this information, making better decisions. And it's also about assessing different aspects, about their emotional endurance and psychological stability. And also learning that even though we are going into this process with the hope that we are going to create life with the help of a donor or just carrier, we also have to explore the idea that may not happen for us, and are we going to be okay with that? How do we cope with that? Do we have coping skills for that? And again, exploring different options. I mean, what happens if you don't have a successful journey? Will we try again? And what does that mean for us?
How do you deal with the bumps in the road, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and unfortunately, and I can look back many years. I can look back almost 20 years now from when I first got involved in surrogacy and I did my first journey, and then compare it to my two more recent journeys. And a lot of things have changed, and just medically, coming from a medical perspective, things change all the time in the medical field. And so they've gotten very good at surrogacy. However, and IVF, and but it's not 100%, and we know that. We have a great chance at it, and the numbers, the percentage looks really good, but there is no guarantee. And so, just kind of talking about that, I think I always feel good when I know that intended parents have a handful of embryos to be able to work with a surrogate. That always makes me feel a lot better. There's a lot of pressure involved. Certainly from the surrogate perspective, I can give you an example with my last journey. There was one embryo. They had worked with another surrogate previously. It wasn't successful, and they had one last embryo. So I really felt a huge amount of pressure and stress going into that journey. I was dedicated and I was totally committed to it, and really wanted to see it work. And unfortunately for them, it did. But sometimes there can be stress and anxiety, and sometimes, unfortunately, heartache, I think, just depending on the circumstances.
And Joey, that actually I was thinking about, what about a situation, for instance, where maybe they've both provided the sperm sample, but maybe they only get embryos from one, or maybe some embryos are not as viable as from the other partner. Are those issues that you deal with in your practice?
Yes, that's all tied into the interview that I have with intended parents. So we cover a lot of these things that we're talking about today. That is also one of them. I do raise, the question of what happens if one of you happens to have 6 viable embryos and one has a not so well graded embryo, and how do you make those decisions? And if you were planning to have a sibling journey, and how does that look like? And would you do another egg retrieval? And would you feel comfortable, just again having this one partner be the genetic father? And so we explore all of these things. Again, just bringing awareness. And I think that these, we have a lot of blind spots going into this process, and the more information that we provide or things that we raise awareness to is what's going to allow for us intended parents to have a better understanding of what to expect. I know that a lot of intended parents don't like going through this process because they want to keep positive or a positive outlook, and they don't want to think about all of these things. But I always have to remind them, like, I get you, I understand, because I've been there. But it's also important just to have awareness and have insight. If we don't have this awareness and insight, it can really just have a huge impact on us emotionally and our mental health if we're not just keeping it, in sight.
Right. Education. Have I missed anything? Are there any other tough issues that you think people should be aware of before they start this journey?
One of the things that I have personally haven't found that is talked about much, and I know this also by personal experience, that I didn't learn about this until right before, our daughter was going to be born, is the importance of having a birth plan. So sometimes, we're matched with gestational carers that are not within our area, or they're out of state. And I think that a birth plan is very important to help, I guess, protect, our baby and ourselves, and what happens in the event that we are not present for the birth. And, who are, important people who the hospital can reach out to in case we're not available, or we're in an airplane somewhere trying to get to the gestational care at the hospital. I think discussing a birth plan is very important. I again, a lot of the intended parents that I interview either have never heard about it before, or maybe someone did mention it, but they didn't have information on it. So I think this piece is also highly important to be aware of. And if their attorney or agency isn't talking about this, and maybe they should be asking questions about this, like, what does this look like? Where can we learn more about this? How can we develop one to have, especially if you're being matched with a gestational carer who's out of your local area, like a different state.
So I think that is a misconception, because who makes the decision about the birth plan, and what's included in the birth plan? Is it because it's the surrogate who's giving birth, but what are the things that they should be thinking about?
some of the things I point out that I didn't in my personal birth plan is, like who assumes like the responsibility of the care for the child? Because I think that also it's a misconception that intended parents believe that after the baby is born, like the surrogate takes care of the baby or they take full responsibility for the baby, right? And so just again having awareness that that isn't the case. But that they have to identify like, okay, who, if it's going to take me a week to get there, especially with COVID right now and COVID related restrictions on travel or travel bans, we have to think about this, like what does that mean and who can take care of our baby or the responsibility for the care of our baby. So thinking about that and thinking about, I think in our birth plan we also had to identify like what our baby was going to be eating. Is it breast milk? Is it formula? I think the hospitals need to know this, and they have like a little board of where like they write down like what the babies are eating, and just have an idea of like, okay, what's important for us in terms of what they eat, and then having a discussion as well with your gestational carrier about are they open to pumping breast milk for us, and and that one's important because that one also goes into the legal contract, right? And then also like in the event that you're not there and you're not reachable and there needs to be like some type of medical procedure or the hospital needs some consent for a procedure, like who gives consent for that if they can't reach you? So those are some of the things that I bring up and point out. Obviously there's a lot of more things, but those are some of the things that just are popping up for me right now because we definitely cover those for sure.
Jeanette, does the surrogate get involved in the birth plan as well?
Absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So in terms of the birth plan from the surrogate's perspective, it's going to be focused on everything during labor, right? So everything up until the point of where the baby's born. So in terms of who does she want to have in the birthing room with her while she's in labor, in active labor? What does that look like? Maybe does she have a doula or does she have a midwife in there with her? What type of music does she want? All the things that are going to revolve around her up until the birth of the baby. Everything after that will be the birth plan that will be focused on what the intended parents' wishes are. And so and I think it's so great that Joey talked about this, and it's one thing that with our agency that we incorporated, I soon learned that it was so very helpful because then everybody knew what those expectations look like, but also understanding that sometimes things can go a little bit awry and they may not look like what we think they're going to look like on paper, but just kind of understanding what everyone's expectations are. So there's lots of things, injections that babies need to get after birth, vitamin K, ointments, things like that, all of those things. If it's a boy, do the parents want the baby to be circumcised? Are they okay with the baby having a pacifier? So a lot of those things can be indicated and can be very clear and can be provided to the hospital. And most hospitals and facilities are very open to adhering to those wishes of both parties.
I know I did speak with some dads, and they didn't understand. They didn't have this support, and it surprised me because they said they got to the birth. The hospital wasn't really comfortable or experienced with surrogacy births with male couples, and the hospital kept asking them, where's the mother? Like, how's the mother doing? And nobody had really talked to them about navigating that relationship and those conversations. In fact, that's kind of why I wanted to talk with you, Joey, because it was really eye-opening to me that these things weren't talked about ahead of time, even for this couple. I have a question here. Maybe the question's, we're asking ourselves right now where to start. Do we have to start searching for an agency first, or is it better to find an IVF clinic and an egg donor? And I know the answer to that. I don't know if you guys want to answer that.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that what we always suggest is that first start with your mental health therapist, Joey. Find yourself a clinic, or Donor Concierge can help you find a clinic. But we always suggest to people to have the embryos ready to go so that you know what you're working with, and having as we talked about, all those conversations about, who's providing the genetics, Then you can start forward. So it's a step-by-step process, right, Jeanette? Then we start with the surrogate search to find an appropriate surrogate. It's a lot to take on, isn't it? All these things at once. So, is that what you would have said to people, Joey?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and it just depends too, like when you become aware of the information that we're sharing, because again, you will not know this until you know it. Sometimes things can go out of order. I know that I started my own research about, how do you create, embryos, and so that led me to searching for a fertility clinic, and then the fertility clinic referred me to the mental health provider before we even created course. So if you can start off, I would say start by visiting a mental health provider who has information or experience with third-party reproduction, so that you can get learn to process what your expectations are, what your feelings are, what your idea of building a family looks like, or what it is for you, and also just learning about the steps and everything that's involved. So getting that psychoeducation. And then that way you can move on forward in your process. But yes, so mental health provider, fertility clinic, and then surrogacy agency.
Or egg donor.
Egg donor.
We start with egg donor,
yes.
Yeah.
Egg donor with a fertility.
And Joey, just to wrap up, how do people get in touch with you?
You can definitely reach out to me by searching for me at counselingwithjoey.com. Or you can visit, my Facebook page, which is Joey Guzman-Kuffel, LMFT. And on these different, avenues, you can have, further information on how do you email me or give me a call if you'd like.
That's great. Thank you both so much. There's so much more to talk about, but I think we covered a lot. So
yes.
Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us today.